The human mind is a curiously resilient vessel. It can entertain the most outlandish fancies and witness the most spectral of phenomena. Yet, upon waking in the clear light of a new day, it will immediately set about the task of domesticating the impossible. It seeks rational explanations. It clutches at the straws of coincidence, and it attempts to weave the most jagged edges of the supernatural into the smooth, familiar tapestry of the everyday. And so it was with the village. The night we listened to Silas Croft's final terrible recording was one of profound and unmitigated dread. The very air in the weary plowman had grown thin and cold, and the stout men gathered there, men who could face a blizzard or a bear with stoic resolve, were reduced to pale, trembling figures, staring at the silent phonograph as if it were a coiled serpent. Yet, by the following noon, the spell had begun to break. The blacksmith was at his forge, the miller was at his stone, and the prevailing talk upon the green was of logic and trickery. Some whispered of ventriloquism, that Silas, in his madness, had somehow mimicked his dead wife's voice. Others, of a more conspiratorial bent, suggested the traveling academic with the phonograph was a charlatan who had orchestrated the entire affair for reasons unknown. The most common theory, and the most comforting, was that the men in the room, primed by ghost stories and strong cider, had simply imagined the resemblance. Master Killian, it was argued, overcome by the memory of his departed friend, had fallen victim to a powerful and pathetic delusion. The voice on the cylinder was merely that of another long-dead scrivener, a woman whose cadence and tone happened to echo, by pure chance, that of the late Elara Croft. I, however, could not so easily dismiss what I had heard, nor the raw, unfeigned terror I had witnessed on the innkeeper's face. Master Killian was not a man given to flights of fancy. His soul was as solid and earthbound as the fieldstones in his inn's foundation. When such a man is shaken to his very core, it is a thing to be noted. I found him late that afternoon in the inn's taproom, which was empty save for the two of us. He was seated by a window, staring out at the hollow's dark mouth, which was visible between two neighboring houses. The pewter tankard in his hands was untouched. The usual placid calm of his countenance was gone, replaced by a deep, troubled gravity. "They think me a fool, Mr. Crayon," he said, without turning to look at me. His voice was low and heavy. "They think themselves safe," I corrected gently, taking a seat opposite him. "There is a difference." He gave a slow, weary nod. "Aye, that's the truth of it. It is easier to call your neighbor a fool than to admit the wolf is at your own door." He finally turned his gaze from the window to me, and his eyes were full of a pain that was clearly more than just fear. It was the pain of memory, sharp and fresh. "You write things down. You are a chronicler of histories." "I try to be," I said. "Then you must know that a history is not just a list of events. It is the story of the people who lived them. The account of Silas, they will write in the town record, will say he was a clockmaker who died of grief and madness. It is a neat and tidy summary, but it is not the truth, not the whole truth." He took a long, slow drink from his tankard, as if to fortify himself. "You wish to understand what happened to Silas. You cannot, not unless you understand what he lost. You cannot know the tragedy of the silence, unless you first knew the beauty of the music." And so, for the better part of 2 hours, as the autumn afternoon bled into a long and purple twilight, Master Killian provided me with the true and sorrowful memoir of Silas and Elara Croft. His was not the account of a distant observer, but the intimate recollection of a friend, and his words painted a picture far more vivid and heartbreaking than any of the village gossip I had heretofore gathered. "I grew up with Silas." Killian began, his gaze turning inward. "We were boys together, though even then he was different. While the rest of us were climbing trees or skipping stones, Silas would be lying in a field with his eyes closed, his head cocked to one side. I asked him once what he was doing. 'I am listening to the grass grow,' he said, with perfect seriousness. And the queer thing is, I almost believed he could. His father, old Master Croft, was much the same, a quiet, meticulous man, who lived more in the world of ticking gears and chiming bells than in the world of men. The boy learned the trade at his father's knee. For Silas, a clock was not a machine for telling time, it was a heart. He spoke of pendulums having a soulful swing, of gears meshing in sweet harmony. He believed every object had its own unique voice, and that if you were quiet enough, you could hear it. It was a strange philosophy for a boy in a farming village, I'll grant you, but there was an innocence to it, a kind of simple wonder that was hard to dislike. He was a lonely lad. His passions were not those of others. He found more company in the symphony of a frog pond at dusk than he did at a barn raising. We all assumed he would live out his days as a bachelor, a gentle and eccentric figure at the edge of village life, content with his clocks and his crickets. And then, Ilara came to town. According to Killian, Ilara was the orphaned niece of the village parson, sent to live with him after her parents had perished in a fire in Albany. She was a quiet girl, possessed of a grace that seemed at odds with the hardy, robust nature of the local women. She did not have their ruddy complexions or their calloused hands. She had the pale, delicate beauty of a winter rose, and a temperament to match. She was like Silas, Killian explained, but in a different key. Where he was a student of the physics of sound, she was a student of its poetry. She played the spinet at the parsonage, simple hymns mostly, but with a touch so full of feeling, it could bring a tear to the eye. She saw the world not as a great machine, but as a great song. They found each other almost immediately. It was as if two solitary notes, hanging in the air, had suddenly discovered they were part of the same chord. I remember seeing them on their first walks together. Silas would be pointing out some bird in a tree, not for its plumage, but for the precise interval between its chirps. And Ilara would not look at him as if he were mad. She would look at him with a kind of profound understanding, and then she would say something like, "It sounds like a happy bird. Its song is in a major key." Their courtship was a thing of beauty. He did not bring her flowers. He brought her songbirds in small wicker cages, which they would listen to for an hour before setting them free. He did not write her poems. He crafted a set of miniature wind chimes from slivers of glass, each one tuned to a different note of the C major scale, her favorite. And when he asked for her hand, he did not present her with a ring. He presented her with a small, exquisitely crafted music box that, when opened, played a simple, haunting melody of his own composition. Their marriage was the happiest I have ever seen. Their little house behind the clockmaker's shop became a kind of sanctuary. It was always filled with sound, the gentle ticking of a dozen clocks, the singing of the kettle, ele respinet, the wind chimes on the porch, but it was a peaceful sound, an ordered sound, a harmony. For Silas, who had spent his life listening to the world, Elera's voice became the keynote around which all other sounds were arranged. It was his tuning fork, his true north. He told me once, when Elera speaks, the whole world makes sense. She was fascinated by Harrows Hollow, just as he was, but again, their fascinations were different. Silas saw it as an acoustic marvel, a natural amphitheater, whose properties he longed to measure and understand. Elera saw it as a place of deep, ancient sorrow. She was the one who told me she could sometimes feel the murmur, even when she could not hear it. She described it as a cold spot in the air, a sadness in the soil. She would not go deep into the valley, claiming it felt like trespassing in a place of private grief. "That is a church for a congregation of ghosts," she once said. "We have no business there." Here, Killian paused and stared into the dregs of his tankard. The fire in the hearth had died down to a bed of sullen, glowing embers, and the taproom was filled with the deep blue shadows of twilight. And then, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, she fell ill. It was a lung fever. It came on fast and burned hot. For 2 weeks the music of their house changed. The dominant sound was no longer the spinet or the clocks, but the sound of Elera's ragged, painful breathing, and the sound of Silas's frantic, desperate prayers. I was with him the night she died. The doctor had left, shaking his head. There was nothing more to be done. It was just Silas and I, sitting by her bedside. She was unconscious, her breath a faint, shallow whisper. The house was utterly silent. In a panic, Silas had stopped every clock in the house. He said he could not bear to hear them ticking away the last moments of her life. He was trying to stop time itself. Just after midnight, she opened her eyes. They were clear. For the first time in days, she looked at Silas, and a small, sad smile touched her lips. She tried to speak, but all that came out was a faint, rattling sigh, a single puff of air, and then she was gone. I will never forget the sound that came out of Silas in that moment. It was not a cry of grief. It was a sound of pure ontological horror. It was the sound of a man whose entire universe had just been rendered silent and meaningless. It was the sound of a tuning fork that has lost its note. After the funeral, a new kind of silence fell over his house. It was not the peaceful silence of the woods. It was a dead silence. An aggressive, suffocating silence that seemed to push outwards, to nullify all other sound. His friends tried to visit, to offer comfort, but we could not penetrate it. To sit in a room with him was to feel your own words die in your throat.
He would just sit there staring at the wall, and you could feel that he was not merely sad, he was listening. He was listening to the absence of her voice, and it was the loudest thing in the world. Killian fell silent for a long time. The only sound was the low groan of the wind around the inn's eaves. "Now do you see, Mr. Crayon?" he said at last. "When he went into that hollow, he was not just a madman chasing a ghost story. He was a man who had lost the one sound that gave his world meaning, and he had found a place that was saturated with sound, with a million voices. He was not trying to hear the dead, he was trying to find a sound loud enough to drown out the silence she had left behind. But the hollow, it is a hungry place. It does not just hold sorrow, it collects it. And it found in Silas the greatest sorrow it had ever known. It took it from him. It absorbed his grief, just as it had absorbed the confessions of the Shreveners, and the dying lament of his own dear wife. When I heard her voice on that wax cylinder, it was not just the ghost of Lara Croft. It was the ghost of their love, the ghost of his happiness. It was the sound of the music right before the silence, and Silas heard it. At the very end, his machine worked. It cut through the noise and found the one voice he longed to hear. And the sound of it, the terrible, beautiful, impossible sound of it, was the last thing his heart could bear. I left Master Killian to his solitude, and retired to my own room, but not to sleep. His memoir had provided the missing piece of the puzzle, the emotional truth that underpinned the spectral phenomenon. My mind reeled with a new terrifying hypothesis. The murmur was not a passive recording, it was an active, resonant force. Just as a string on a violin will vibrate when its specific note is played nearby, so too did the hollow seem to vibrate in sympathy with profound human sorrow. It was an archive, yes, but a living one. It did not merely store the confessions of the Shriveners, it had actively drawn them from their souls. It had found in the despair of a dying Lara Croft, a sorrow that resonated perfectly with its own ancient melancholy, and it had recorded her soul's final grieving confession. And then it had found Silas, a man whose grief was an abyss. It had called to him, not with the promise of hearing his wife, but with the simple seductive promise of sound itself, a replacement for the silence that was destroying him. And in his final moments, it had given him what he most desired, and the fulfillment of that desire had obliterated him. I knew then that my investigation was not complete. To understand Silas's final journey, I had to see his work. I had to read his journals. They were still in the possession of the constable, locked away as the mundane effects of a madman. I had to convince him that they were not merely the scribblings of a lunatic, but the field notes of a man who had journeyed into a territory far stranger and more terrifying than any charted on a map. They were the key, I felt, not only to understanding the tragedy of Silas Croft, but to deciphering the terrible, sorrowful grammar of the hollow itself. My sleep that night was fitful, and my dreams were filled with the hiss and crackle of a wax cylinder, and a low, ceaseless murmur that spoke of sorrows too deep for any human tongue to tell.